And good afternoon. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I have the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute. And that means I get to thank you all for joining us today for a conversation about what attaches people to their communities, which could not be more timely as we think about this feeling we have all today of being detached and what we're going to need to do to both reattach to one another and to place and to do better in achieving equity ahead. For a change, I'm excited because I get to be a panelist today and let someone else moderate, and we could have no one better. Yvette Alexander is the Director of Learning and Impact at the Knight Foundation, and she will help to shape and facilitate our conversations with a fabulous group of great friends and thought leaders. But before I move to my panelist role, I need to do a couple of thank yous and a couple of logistics. First, I want to thank the Knight Foundation for their powerful support for understanding and driving what helps us to anchor to our communities, things such as arts, culture, and recreational spaces, and for centering equity, both for access and investment in building community. Also, my thanks to the great teams at Urban and Knight that have worked together on this project and to pull together this event. You're going to hear from Urban's own Molly Scott, lead author of this report, in a few minutes. And then finally, some quick housekeeping. This event is being recorded and it'll be posted online afterwards, so you can come and find what you wanted to hear again. The slides are going to be also available online, along with some resources from all of our different organizations, Knight and Urban, and anything else that comes up in the conversation. So type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. We'll be trying to sift through as many as we can, but even if we don't get to them all, they're really helpful to us to see what you're asking. And finally, join the conversation online by using social media and the hashtag #LiveAtUrban so we can have another layer to the conversation. So with that, I turn it over to Yvette. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sarah. So by way of setting a little context before we dig into the findings, well before COVID-19 shut down community life as we know it, Knight Foundation commissioned Urban Institute to survey over 11,000 residents across US metro areas to explore one key question: what attaches people to the places where they live? And because Knight Foundation's mission is to foster more informed and engaged communities, we care a lot about this question. And understanding what ties residents to their community may be even more important now, today, in a post-pandemic America. Many of us have become more acutely aware of the amenities of city life that were rendered inaccessible during closures. And at the same time, new questions are being raised, good questions about racial equity and what the future of community will look like. This study suggests that providing equitable access to key quality of life amenities at the heart of communal life, all while solving for safety, might be the new holy grail for post-pandemic community design. How we get there is the focus of our panel conversation today. But before we kick off our panel, Principal Research Associate Molly Scott of the Urban Institute is here to quickly unpack key findings for you all. And I want to mention that we chose Urban Institute for this work because they are a trusted source for unbiased and authoritative insights that can inform decision-making about the well-being of people and places in the US, and Molly has been dedicated to delivering on that every step of the way. Molly, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Yvette. Thanks for joining us, everyone who's on the line today. Excited to have the opportunity to walk you through a little bit the work that we did on the Community Ties study and some of its implications for the important work that needs to happen in communities to foster attachment and make sure that they're inclusive places for everyone. Next slide. I want to start just talking a little bit about the key research questions. Yvette alluded to this earlier. The biggest picture question that we had was just how attached are people to their metros? And we went through a whole process about how to define what we even meant by that, which I'm going to talk about in a second. We also asked, why do people choose to stay or go? That's really critical to a lot of local policymakers trying to figure out how to retain people in place and how to attract talent and people who are going to be making really meaningful contributions to their communities. And second, what are the factors that attach people to the place where they live? What sort of things make the biggest difference? And I think we found some really interesting patterns with that. Overall, as Yvette alluded, 2, we interviewed about 11,500 people. There is both a national sample of people who live in urban areas across the country to sort of serve as a benchmark. And then we did smaller surveys in all of the different 26 communities where the Knight Foundation does its work, including the core 8, where there's actually a Knight Foundation present. And the remaining 18 are places where the Knight Foundation partners with local community foundations. Next slide. So what do we mean by attachment? This was something that we really wrestled with Sam Gill and others at the Knight Foundation through a really larger design phase. What does it mean to be attached? We ended up with 2 sort of different kinds of measures. The ones are sort of how you feel, attachment sentiment. So, questions like how satisfied are you with the metro where you live? How good a fit is it in terms of sort of culture and lifestyle? Do you feel identified with the place? And lastly, if you had your druthers, if you had real options, would you choose to stay? Or would you choose to go somewhere else? So those are the sort of attachment sentiments that we looked at. And then we also asked questions about a number of what we would call attachment behaviors, or things that people actually do to demonstrate that they are connected in the places where they live. So the first is what we're calling community investment. We asked a bunch of different questions about the ways that people can participate in the life of their community, whether it's volunteering or donating goods or services, or buying a home, or investing in a local business, or attending local meetings, or participating in community change. A really wide array of different ways that people contribute to their communities in real meaningful ways and demonstrate maybe the feelings that they have about a place. The second attachment behavior is about what we call social bridging capital. So we know that places that have more of those loose ties or loose connections between people who are maybe not the same across race, across class, across language, are the ones that have maybe the strongest democratic culture and the most overall community cohesion, right? And so we really asked some questions about people's relationships, their own social networks, and really how integrated they were across these different lines. And lastly, we asked questions about, how long have you lived in the place where you live, right? And are you someone who's a native of that area and has stayed, or are you a new transplant? And how are you invested in that place? So attachment sentiments, attachment behaviors, 2 different ways of thinking about the sort of concept of attachment. Next slide. So highlights of what we found. We found that there were 3 drivers that were consistently associated with a greater sense of attachment, whether that be in feeling or in action. The most universal one was the amount of time that people spent actually in the city within their larger metro area, right? That sort of central city. So folks who were in the city every day, whether because they live there or they commuted into the city or spent time there, maybe because their kid plays on a soccer team there, or anything that connects people back to the city more frequently. Those folks tended to feel a greater sense of attachment to the metro overall, right? Even if they live in the suburbs, which is sort of an interesting thing. And they not only felt more attached, but they also demonstrated that attachment more actively in those sort of attachment behaviors that we were talking about. We also found that there were particular aspects or particular amenities of communities that tended to foster attachment more strongly than others. So in particular, people who said that people like them and who live in their neighborhood had easy access to recreational areas, arts and culture, and safe places to live, work, and play. People who said that they had better access to those sorts of things tended to feel much more attached to the place. And in the case of arts, we found that it not only strengthened the feeling of attachment, but also the amount of that people actively invested in their community through their behaviors. And lastly, we found that people who chose to move to an area because of quality of life, or said that they chose to stay in the area because of something having to do with quality of life, those people tended to have stronger feelings of attachment to the metropolitan areas where they live. So those are some of our main findings. Next slide. But we know that each of those different things is maybe different in different communities, right? And maybe different amenities are more important than others and other things like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the variation that we see, for example, across these different communities. The advantage of doing this survey in all these 9 communities is because it gives us sort of a wider range of different touch points. So again, we have the punchline that people who spend more time in the city are more attached to their metros, both in feeling and in action. Next slide. But the share of people who are spending the time regularly in the city is really different depending on what area we're talking about, right? So you have a place like Macon, Georgia, right, where the city really is the heart of the economy and all social life, right? It's also a city county. And so you see really high percentages of people in that metro area that are in the city every day, right? Then on the other extreme, you have places like St. Paul, where there's also an additional central city, right? It's not just St. Paul, it's also Minneapolis. And it's also one of these metro areas that has a pretty extensive network of county suburbs surrounding it, right? And so in that area, you see a much smaller share of people who are in the city every day. So, you know, the dynamics around, bringing people into the city or the accessibility of the city are really very different in different metropolitan areas. Next slide. Then we have, patterns in terms of why people choose the metros where they live. Next slide. We see a pretty good amount of variation across communities along those lines as well. Generally, we see that quality of life tends to be a little bit bigger driver for people in terms of staying in the metro if they're natives. It's also important for attracting people. But we can see that quality of life is a much more major factor in a metro like Miami with its great climate. That's something that people named explicitly about Miami than it is in cities like Macon or Detroit. So we can see that those sort of factors on their relative importance are maybe really different in different kinds of communities. Next slide. And then lastly, there's the access to quality recreational areas, arts and culture, and safe spaces to live, work, and play. Next slide. Those aren't all equally accessible, right? So on the positive side, you see that recreational areas, quality recreational areas are among the most accessible amenities that we have across communities, right? Almost 90% of respondents overall said that there were recreational areas that were accessible and of good quality for them, that made them feel good. On the other hand, access to safe spaces and access to arts and culture are much more difficult in comparison. And there's a lot of geographic variation as well along those lines. Next slide. So another really important theme through all of this is that demographics really matter, right? Who you are really matter. We actually found that attachment had maybe the most to do with who you are as a person and maybe less to do with the particular place where you live, right? Similar people are having similar experiences no matter where they live. Next slide. So for example, racial and ethnic minorities, people of color are systematically reporting lower levels of access to the quality of life amenities that seem to matter the most, right? And actually, almost across the board for all different kinds of amenities. And the great irony of this is that people of color also said across the board that the things that make up public infrastructure are relatively more important to them than to other folks. And so we see sort of a great demand for the kind of quality of life enhancement that those amenities can provide, and at the same time, so much more difficulty being able to enjoy them in the communities where people of color live. So very important. And then next slide. We also see similar trends by household income, right? So not surprisingly, folks who have lower household income, again, they report even more demand for quality public amenities, how important they are to their quality of life. They have much more difficulty accessing them. Next slide. So what does this mean? So in a pre-COVID world, looking at the different findings that we had around the things that tend to boost attachment, it makes a whole lot of sense for policymakers in a metropolitan area, even folks who are maybe looking at policies for their suburban communities, to be thinking about how they can strengthen the ties with the city, right? Because there were some implications there that bringing people into city life more frequently can foster their attachment to the community writ large, which is sort of an interesting thing. So having that more sort of regional approach to things. Focus on quality of life and how important that is. Making the kinds of investments in quality recreational facilities, arts and culture, and making sure that public space to live, work, and play is equally accessible to everyone. But again, one of the most important punchlines is this one around equity. If policymakers aren't very careful in the kinds of investments that they make, they may actually be exacerbating inequalities and inequities around race, ethnicity, and income, rather than ameliorating those disparities, right? So it's really important in figuring out how to make those investments in quality of life that they specifically are undertaken with an equity lens. Next slide. But then we have sort of the challenges that have arisen in the current context, and ones that I know that the panelists are going to speak to, right? With COVID-19, what it means to have safe places to live, work, and play is maybe really different than it was, a year ago, right? Have to sort of be thinking about that differently. With the need for social distancing, it makes it more difficult maybe to bring people together, or maybe we have to have different ways to do that. It may redefine the way we think about what it means to be attached. Some people may actually have greater desire to change the kinds of places they're living within their metro, to be able to feel safe, and others at the same time, because of job loss and other things, may or may not be able to make the choices to move even if they would like to. And in general, more densely populated places are more complicated, more challenging environments to live in. What does that mean for the implications for bringing people into the city in that context? And we just may need to be thinking very differently about public space in general. And then, the last and really probably most important thing about the current context is the racial justice movement. It really puts extra emphasis on these findings around equity and how important they are and how urgent they are to be addressed. So looking forward to the conversation of the panelists today, the experts we had to talk about communities and policy, and try to unpack the findings of the study and apply, what they mean in this new context. Yvette?
Great, thanks, Molly. Now let's jump into today's conversation on cultivating community and bridging divides in our cities. I want to welcome our panelists today. It would take the rest of our time to get through their illustrious bios, so I'll just quickly introduce them. We have with us today Maria Rosario Jackson. She is Senior Advisor of Arts and Culture at the Kresge Foundation. We have Bruce Katz, Founding Director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University. We have Lynn Ross, a founder and principal at Spirit for Change Consulting here in Miami. And we have Sarah Rosen-Wortel, president of Urban Institute that you spoke to earlier. So some of the key drivers of higher attachment levels among residents that Molly talked about had to do with having access to quality of life amenities like arts and cultural activities, recreational areas like parks and trails, and safe community spaces. And these actually had a stronger relationship to resident attachment even than having access to necessities like jobs, healthcare, or housing, which are important. So Lynn, the first question is for you. Now having lived through COVID and the rollback of access to these types of spaces, are things like parks and culture still extra amenities and nice to haves, or are they more critical to our communities?
They're certainly more critical to our communities. Even before the pandemic, there was a growing body of research that told us that access to arts and culture, access to nature, our parks, all had tremendous benefits for our health, our mental and physical health, and our well-being. That has been, truly highlighted throughout this pandemic. And so, what I would love us to do in this conversation, and certainly in the conversations happening in communities across this country, is shift away from talking about these as amenities. What they really are is critical civic infrastructure. When we use the term amenities, right, we're implying that these are nice to haves, that they're not public goods, and that it's okay for some people to have access and other people to not have access. When we pivot the conversation to something being a critical civic asset, that means, an infrastructure rather, that means everyone should have access to it. So that changes our conversation around investment, it changes our conversation around equity.
Great. Sarah, why might these types of quality of life amenities be important in connecting people to the place where they live?
Well, it was interesting. Lynn just called them assets, and I actually think that's a good way to think about them, because it isn't an amenity, because what do assets give you in life? I heard Derek Hamilton say this yesterday. I thought it was a great thing. He said, we were talking about, in this case, savings, but these are public goods, public assets that support people. Assets are functional. They provide you agency and autonomy. They give you the ability to make choices. And in this case, many of these assets are ones that allow you to connect to opportunity. Those opportunities may be safe spaces, give you access to opportunities to the job. They may be opportunities to improve your physical health. They may be opportunities for better education and for sort of the cultural richness and your own intellectual advancement that comes from and emotional advancement that comes from engaging with the arts and culture. So this is not a nice to have. These things are important to people because they represent key elements of their ability to be powerful and autonomous human beings. And then, of course, there's an emotional bond to this too. Think about all the ways that we process and relate to information and connect. We do through stories, we do through experience, and these are places that give you experience. And then the last thing I'll just say is, I was really struck listening to Molly that about the difference in availability and access. And that's not an accident. Those were policy choices that we made to create amenities in one place and not another, to build highways that disconnected people from access to opportunity. That structural racism mapped across our geographies. And so people it relates to the emotional attachment as well. People feel that choice that is in our society, and they should recognize the harm and feel that disconnection. If we want to rebuild connection, we need to be intentional about thinking about that bridge.
Great. So thinking about rebuilding that connection and these critical assets, Bruce, what does all this mean as cities reopen and perhaps rethink their planning?
Well, I think in the post-COVID environment, attachment is going to rely more on local authenticity. What makes places different, what makes them special. The concern going forward is we're going to lose a lot of that. we're going to lose those special small businesses that we all think about when we think about our neighborhood and our city. And particularly, we're going to lose a lot of Black and brown-owned businesses because of their lack of access to mainstream financial capital. So going forward, I think what could be quite interesting here is that local investors, not just the public, private, civic, across the board, can be thinking about reinvesting in local and really enhancing what's special and distinctive and authentic about your place. Buy local, invest local, supply local, and particularly arts and culture has such distinctiveness across the US, and how you build that not just around art, but around public spaces. The Brick Line area that's underway in St. Louis, I think, has done probably the best in recent memory of democratic participation that respects different values, different cultures, different history. So local, I think, is going to become one of the dominant themes in the aftermath of COVID.
Great. Another key finding that emerged in the study is that of equity, which was Molly raised. And, we know that some of the folks most likely to stay rooted in a particular place are people of color. And they say that these quality of life assets and infrastructures are important to them. Yet they have a harder time accessing them than white residents. So I want to ask you, Maria, why do you think that for communities of color, access to things like arts and cultural experiences are really prominent dimensions of their quality of life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I'm going to echo some of the things that were already said in that, put differently, I think that arts and cultural assets in communities are part of what we rely on to publicly recognize our humanity. So much of what we do in my root field, planning and community development, often is devoid of recognition of that humanity. We get caught up with the widgets of housing and the efficiency in certainly bringing about really important basic needs, often with a blind spot for how the recognition of one's humanity is a basic need. And I think this happens often through arts and culture, particularly for communities of color where their experience, I'll just say within a US context, but I think it is true in other places as well, has been one that has intentionally dehumanized to have access to the things that are actively working against that. Seems critical to me, absolutely critical. In some work that I did actually when I was at Urban, in looking at the importance of cultural participation, there's the value of arts and culture in and of itself, period. And then there are these other ways that it matters. Participation can lead to intergenerational connection, to affirmation of identities, to bridging to new groups, to actually a lot of the other things that the study points to. So these things are interconnected. And if we think expansively about arts and culture, that interconnection is even more pronounced.
Let's drill down a little bit on this idea of access. And I want to go back over to you, Lynn. How should we define what it means for people to have access to these types of community assets? And is access enough, or are there other considerations?
Access is not enough, right? I mean, I think the way we should define access is what it is. It is a precondition for getting to equity and getting to justice. Access alone will not get us there. Proximity to these assets alone will not get us there, right? I could live right next door to a park. That park might be public, but my experience in that space may not be a good one. So access and proximity won't get us there. What we need to do is have a much broader and deeper conversation about how we get to equity and justice in these spaces. I think one of the interesting findings in the study, there's a lot of conversation around safety. And as I read that in the report, I thought, well, safety for whom? right? So safety is experienced very differently. Real or perceived safety is experienced very differently along racial lines, along gender lines, others. So I think, the conversation we ought to be having is how do we define equitable outcomes in these spaces? Certainly equity, is essential. We've got to have, access to do that. We've got to have proximity to do that, but we have to have a much more nuanced conversation around safety, not just safety in a health context with the pandemic, but also thinking about the uprisings around racial justice. We have to have a conversation about what it means for everyone to feel safe, to feel welcome, intentionally welcomed in these spaces. That's not what's happening right now. And I think we also have to explore what it means to have spaces that are places for healing. We are all in the midst of some collective trauma right now, and the way that we're experiencing that is also deeply inequitable. And as we think about what it looks like for our communities to emerge from that and emerge whole and in a better place, we really need to think about acknowledging that trauma and thinking about these cultural assets, these public spaces as places of healing and equitable healing at that.
So thinking of access, not just geographically, but, places where you feel like you belong and are welcomed.
And feel free.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's really what we want to have happen in these spaces. We want an experience of freedom, but that can't happen if you don't feel safe, you don't have access, you're not proximate, and you don't experience that intentional welcome.
Yes. So I want to shift a little bit, but still staying with the equity piece. Metros, are often, as we know, very segregated places. Historically, suburbs have been wider, the cities and more affluent, the cities look a little bit different. But now there's kind of a growing reversal of that trend in some metro areas, some movement of different communities to the suburbs. And so, I guess a question for you, Bruce, would be on what scale should we be thinking about access to these types of assets? Should we be thinking about the city, the neighborhood, the entire metro area, particular districts or streets? How is this tackled?
Well, it's not your parents' metro and it's not your parents' suburbs, no matter what the president says. So I think what we're seeing is just dramatic demographic and economic change in the suburbs, and they've been underway for decades. So the metropolitan scale, I think, is the right scale if we really want to think about reducing racial and ethnic disparities at scale. And that's not just for government or public funding. That's for philanthropy, which tends to be overly focused on the city. That tends to be for a lot of civic investing writ large, which tends to be over-focused on the city. So I think there's sort of always a lag time. Demographic and economic forces sort of occur and they change the spatial geography of the communities in which we live. And it takes us several decades to sort of catch up. And as we think about going forward here and think about investing in the civic infrastructure, it's so critical to think about that civic infrastructure that cuts across jurisdictional lines, our greenways, our riverways, our arts and culture, and then many of similar places, main streets, business districts, commercial corridors, that really have had similar impacts during this during these pandemics. So Metro for me is the right way to think about it. How we design can be more localized and customized.
So for some of these assets that you're talking about, that Bruce is talking about, Maria, in thinking about enhancing access to these assets, the green spaces, the corridors, the commercial life, and arts and culture, clearly, for communities of color in particular, what should be considered? What should local leaders be thinking about?
So I think Lynn actually pointed to a lot of what I would say related to this in terms of defining what it is, right? So to Lynn's point, safety for whom? Safety can look very different depending on who you are, where you are, what your experience has been in the past, and how people perceive you. So the concept of civic infrastructure is something that I'm thinking a lot about at Kresge, and thinking about how does that need to be redefined in this moment when we're having these we're having these epiphanies in some ways, but not, sometimes we knew better, and we knew better all along. But when we're reckoning with what a society actually needs to be healthy, you know, how can civic infrastructure account for places of healing, places of collective mourning, again, places that respect people's humanity. So to be inclusive of all of these things, their plays and our expanding understanding of what that can be as preconditions for other kinds of things that we're more used to looking for, right? So I think in terms of access, if we do change our concept of civic infrastructure to be inclusive of this, the kinds of investments that go into that, the kinds of alliances across sectors, inclusive of arts and culture, look different because we have a fundamentally different understanding of why it matters.
So as we think about a strategy for more, as you said, inclusive planning to make sure diverse voices are heard and amplified in planning processes and budget conversations, that we really understand what residents need practically, emotionally, as you've been pointing out. Sarah, as cities figure out their post-COVID planning, and as we rebuild our civic fabric, which has been quite frayed and may continue to be frayed through the rest of this year, what's important for local leaders to lean into?
So I think there are three things to think about. You mentioned the sort of frayed trust. If you're a local leader in a community with really intense distrust and anger, it's very hard to build consensus around policy, et cetera. Secondly, we have an economy that's hurting, and local leaders are going to be focused on driving economic growth and getting people back to work. So, and third thing, resources are going to be incredibly tight. Incredibly tight, especially at the state and local level where they don't have the ability to deficit spend as we do federally. And I'm really actually quite terrified about the things. That's why Lynn's framing of this not as an amenity, but as an essential piece of infrastructure necessary for growth and necessary for healing becomes so important. This study starts to give us, I wouldn't say it's a complete economic proof point, but it starts to give us an understanding of why actually our economic recovery and our ability to have a recovery that's inclusive is tied to investing in this civic infrastructure. Because you saw that people are much more likely to stay in a place if they feel this attachment. And we also are hearing in local real estate markets about some very big rapid shifts of where people are demanding housing and what kind of housing they want. And local leaders are going to want to hold their tax base. So this kind of amenity base is going to be really important. Amenity base, I got to prune it from my own vocabulary. This kind of infrastructure is going to be really important, but we have to get people to be intentional about it and to be thinking about why this builds equity and why equity, and here Urban's research is very clear, inclusive recoveries are more sustainable and stronger recoveries. So these assets are critical to a whole theory of recovery for these cities.
So thinking about those assets and what it means to do an inclusive recovery and inclusive planning, Lynn, maybe you could share with us what kind of approaches to this that you've seen to be more effective.
Yeah, so happy to share something near and dear to my heart, which is Reimagining the Civic Commons, which is funded in part by Knight Foundation, but also with Kresge, with JPB and William Penn. And this is, a national demonstration that we've been working in 5 cities since 2016, just expanded to 5 additional cities earlier this year. It's a demonstration with some ambitious goals around creating equitable public spaces. So these are local teams that include residents, so a very resident-led effort to really develop not a model for inclusive and equitable public space, but many models, right? So really honing in on what is authentic about that place, but doing it in a larger frame that says, we know civic engagement really matters. We know environmental stewardship really matters. We know creating value for the existing residents and existing businesses really matter. And we know that environmental stewardship is also a key piece of this. So how can we develop and really co-create a model that works in cities large and small, fast growth markets, slow growth markets? That's really what we've been exploring. And just last week, actually, Civic Commons and Urban Institute released a report that really captures a lot of the insights from our first 4 years with Civic Commons. And I really recommend that to folks who want to understand how it's working in our 5 cities and what we've learned about having a very equity forward approach to these assets.
Great. Well, let's switch gears a little bit to talk about how one funds such an approach. So, we have different players. There's, there's policy changes that help us with funding. There's the philanthropy organizations like the ones you mentioned. Maybe Maria, we could start with you. Many cities, and we've worked with them, have local community foundations or other philanthropic organizations that I think are, their attention is really to this equity issue right now, and maybe to improving, equity within their communities. What's their role in addressing and hopefully funding, the equity piece?
At their best, I think those kinds of institutions help us get unstuck, help us imagine different approaches to problems that have been longstanding and persistent. I think they are in a position to help take risks and do the unorthodox and unsettle the orthodoxies that we don't question enough. I also think that they have a unique role in helping to influence how to shift industry standards. So when we think about civic infrastructure, how do we get to the point where it's just normal to think about issues related to well-being? And equity and healing, and the kinds of things that we've been talking about this morning or afternoon for some. And I also think that they enable synergy, synergy that sometimes synergy across policy silos and silos of practice, that a synergy that sometimes runs counter to our institutional and bureaucratic arrangements. So, for example, I'm particularly interested in the synergy that I see emerging between the community development field and the health field. How the health field, as it recognizes housing as a health issue, how it is beginning to see the community development field as an ally. That confluence is generative, and there's an opportunity to reimagine in both fields and at the intersection. And I think philanthropy is in some ways really powerfully and uniquely positioned to advance that kind of work.
And Bruce, how do you see the funding puzzle here? What levers need to be pulled, and what local policy changes could have an impact there?
Well, Sarah was right on the public side in saying this has to be a federal moment. To date, they've really committed some kind of national malpractice, by not responding to the pain of the nation. But going forward, we need significant transformative federal investment in civic infrastructure. Could be a big piece of that. I think, though, my takeaway relating back to this notion of a local is that anchors need to work harder for the places where they're anchored. And I think one of the biggest exports of cities and metros is their own spend, their own capital. Go talk to your local hospital, go talk to your university, go talk to major corporations, utilities, and banks. Ask them where they actually spend. How do they procure their goods and services? It goes out to a large extent. They're looking for the lowest price. They're not looking for the biggest impact on their community. So as we go forward and think about civic infrastructure, I think we need a radical change, almost like the ESG movement has had on investing. We need a radical change, industry standards for how they spend, how they procure goods and services in ways that grow Black and brown owned businesses, for sure, supplier diversity, but also how they enhance civic infrastructure.
Maybe Sarah, one last question before we kind of close with a round robin. I want to end by coming back to the notion of attachment to place, the emotional and practical ties that we have or sometimes don't have to our communities. What would change? What might change about our cities, our communal life together if residents were more attached or connected to the place where they lived?
Well, there's all kinds of ways in which I think we would see commonality across difference with one another, and feel a kind of satisfaction and contentment with our place in the world and in our home, and our sense that our home is a welcoming place. I really love the way we tried to measure in this the notion of bridging capital. To what extent, not just are you involved in your local church, but are you involved in institutions that bring you together perhaps with people who may not look just like you, not be in the same income spectrum, et cetera. So I think there's a psychological and component of this sense of belonging at a time when we all, I mean, the whole bowling alone movement and the social media, we need those kinds of emotional things. But I think about economic policy, so I will also come back to my sense that there's a real strong case, particularly now as we're on the cusp of what's likely to be a long-lasting and difficult recession that will land very differently on parts of our community, that local leaders are going to be trying to think about economic growth and what they can do to drive it. And this is not like, okay, we're going to recover and be done. What we've seen more economic volatility in the last 15 years than we had seen of a greater kind of degree. We are also seeing the shocks that happen to urban areas from climate change, and turned out we have pandemic and healthcare risks that could continue to make our places vulnerable. So what we really need is a kind of resilience to these ongoing difficulties so that we can thrive both socially and economically. And the attachment that we've been talking about here today is a core element of resilience. You think about the places and the way people came together to man food banks. That happened in some places and not in others. And those are the places where this attachment to community is good, or where people come to help people during flooding, or where there is a sort of a real stepping in to help kids with schools and computers when the pandemic made that difficult. So we actually are going to need to be much more resilient at the local level with support nationally for that. And it seems to me that this is kind of laying some breadcrumbs for how we could get there.
I really love that idea of, people helping people and kind of boots on the ground, and this idea of resiliency being connected somehow with, people who work with their neighbors to create the change that they want to see. So let's just, we want to get to questions from the audience, but let's close with just a quick round robin, and you can try to keep it brief. COVID's disrupted our communities a lot in the way we lead our lives together. What are some lessons learned from the past few months that we can take forward, and maybe what should we be leaving behind? Let's go with Maria. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think that the hopeful part of this context and this moment is that at times we are seeing behaviors that have to do with care for each other that we didn't see before. And we're seeing evidence of, or what could be understood as precedents for arrangements that we didn't think were possible or wouldn't have entertained before. So I think that's important. And I think that's something to hold on to. I also think that if we know that there are systemic changes and changes in our institutional arrangements that underlie the kinds of changes and benefits that we ultimately want to see on the ground in communities, our methods of accountability have to toggle between understanding changes at the local level and understanding systems changes that have to be in place in order for that aspiration to be true. So shifting the gaze from looking exclusively at on-the-ground impacts to also looking at what are the systemic changes that are required for the society we want to embrace and live in. I think that's a really important thing to hold on to.
Perfect. I'm getting time notifications, so super fast. Lynn, what would you bring forward? What would you leave behind?
So I think we need to leave behind that inequity is the way we have to operate, right? We know that that's just actually not true. And I agree with what Maria said. Like, we need to go forward in a way with some big, bold ideas and stop playing around the edges. We have the research. We know what the evidence tells us. Now we need big, bold action that moves us into a more inclusive and equitable future.
Powerful words. Bruce?
Yeah, I think what this is going to do is completely redefine what corporate social responsibility is in the United States, what anchor responsibility is in the United States. I mean, it's what we were doing pre-COVID is nothing close to what we need to do to reduce racial and ethnic disparities. It's not just about public policies, though those matter a lot. It's about the harnessing of these local anchors, their connections, their linkages.
Perfect. Sarah?
So I guess the one thing I'll mention is something we haven't talked about at all today. It's both opportunity and our great challenge, technology. Technology is deeply relevant to how we connect people to these civic infrastructure institutions, to the arts community, to educational assets, and look what we've learned how to do. I mean, I never hosted events like this before. We are reaching many more people by doing this than we did. So we're gonna all want to be together once in a while, but we also are going to learn how to connect to people who being together is hard with. And we want to make sure that as we think about these locally driven strategies that give real voice, we bring technology to it. The great thing we have, it is also revealed for us. I don't even want to use the word digital divide. I think it's really digital inequity that we have so deeply in our society. And in order for it to be the powerful tool it is, we need to invest in that too.
Great, thank you. Those are good food for thoughts. Let's go to the audience questions. I think Molly, you have some for us.
Yes, I definitely do. There's one from Tanisha Laird, which speaks to some of the topics that Bruce was raising around procurement, right, and empowering local organizations. She writes, there are Black-led organizations in communities of color that are more on the ground in the community, but not getting the investment or support to address these disparities and bridging access. How might philanthropy and other funders really start taking this to account and changing the way they procure this work in local communities?
Well, I don't think actually we lack capital. We lack the harnessing of capital to do this. And we lack the understanding that these kind of intermediaries that have capacity and community standing have to have stable, sustained investment. You can do that in part through tax code changes at the local level to have a steady, regenerative kind of financing going on. But it also has to happen in the civic sphere. So capital's not the problem, to tell you the truth. It's how we've deployed capital. And we've almost kept many of these organizations small and anemic. And then, it's not surprising we don't get the results we want. So I think there needs to be sort of an upping of the game here and a different standard setting for what kind of constant, both public but also private and civic support these locally grounded intermediaries and institutions need.
Molly, what else is coming in?
There was a question about how to apply sort of the principles of asset-based community development in this context. How might that be leveraged to help enhance attachment in the current environment?
So I can jump in there. So I think that's exactly the approach that we're taking with Civic Commons, right? So this is not about going into communities and saying, this is what you need, or this is what you should want. It's really about looking at what they have and co-creating with them something that is new. In most cases in the communities we've been working in, it's existing public assets that we've been working with. In the case of Detroit, that is the one place where we actually did need to build a park because that neighborhood didn't have have one, but that was done in very close partnership with neighborhood residents, and it is very much a neighborhood park and a greenway. So I think that asset-based approach is exactly the right one. I think centering any of this work, all of this work on residents, and really bringing residents not just to the table, actually, maybe we don't even need a table, but bringing them along as real co-creators and decision makers about where and how the funding's getting spent really matters.
Great. I think we have time for maybe 2 more, Molly. We can go quickly.
Sure. Any thoughts from the panelists about how to strengthen attachment in rural communities? I know that the study focused on metropolitan areas, cities and suburbs, but I know from the work that you've done, how might this apply in that context?
I just have a thought. I haven't, and Bruce, you may have thought about this more than I have. I would go back to the role that technology plays and shared experience plays, and think a little bit about how we can, I've noticed that in recent era that we've seen more and more businesses start to think about sourcing talent, for example, from rural areas, and trying to build taking advantage of what we've all learned about how you build a workforce. We'll think about whether or not there's some of these equivalent lessons to the challenges we were just talking about could take some of that approach, but I confess I haven't given it deep thought.
You know, the only thought I've given it is that this contraction of the economy and the fact that it's a small business-led recession has had a ubiquitous effect on rural main streets, on suburban commercial corridors, on urban business districts. I mean, everyone's been affected by this. And going forward, I think there could be unifying cut across jurisdiction efforts to basically regenerate these places. I mean, we talk so much about what divides us, but this has had ubiquitous effect. And I think that could, for the smart metros, be a way of healing this long-standing rural-urban divide.
Yeah, and just to add to the comment about rural-urban divide, I think that there are actually some similarities between urban and rural places, and disinvested places in particular, that have to do with isolation. And looking at the nature of isolation in one place and another might reveal some important nuanced differences, but the overarching concept of isolation, I think, is shared.
And we see that, I mean, we've seen that in the deaths of despair, people act as though the recent opioid crisis, for example, was a new phenomenon. It was a new phenomenon in a different population. But what each of those populations have faced is disconnection from a viable economic future for them and their families. And so again, I think there are lots of the shared experiences Bruce describes. If we can bring leaders together from the civic communities. We tend to gather, mayors of like cities, philanthropies of like places, but maybe there's an interesting conversation to be had of unlike places with like experience.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we have more in common when we dig deeper than we might think. Well, that's, I think, all the time we have today. So I'd like to thank our panelists for this conversation. And on behalf of the Urban Institute and Knight Foundation, I'd like to thank you all for joining the conversation today. If you live in the 26 communities where Knight Foundation works, you can explore your own local data from the study in your own community on our interactive website at kf.org/community ties. And for more resources on these and other topics of community life, please visit the Urban Institute at urban.org, and have a wonderful day.